We're going to have a keynote from Molly Thompson, who is the head and the founder of A&E IndieFilms, which is part of the A&E Network. So Molly is going to talk about her experience, which is kind of unusual, but also she really founded one of the premier strands of feature documentaries. But before we see her and meet her, let's show a reel of the highlights of A&E IndieFilms.
The men and women of Raqqa is being slaughtered silently.
Either we will win or they will kill all of us.
In this town, if you're religious, God is Joe Paterno, but then Jesus would be Jerry.
There's an imaginary line out there between good and evil.
Somos autodefensas. Muchas gracias.
This is a generation that's going to serve the Lord all the days of your life.
No more, Lord. No more. No more.
13 million people will get the September issue of Vogue.
Fashion's not about looking back. It's always about looking forward.
He's using these movies to make sense of the world he actually is living in, our world.
Think hard.
David and Goliath's story out here.
I brought myself down.
Pat Tillman has been killed.
Attack, 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 attack!
She's not my mother, and you know it.
This is a really big room, and it's a sign of how this event has grown. I want to remember to thank Claire and Simon and everybody at the IDA, but also it's an indication of what they've put together here, because in the first year, I persuaded my friend John Batzik, who I've produced a lot of films with, to fly over from London for a Q&A with me. And I'm not exaggerating, I think there were 8, maybe 10 people in the room. So this is quite a different experience, so bear with me if I get nervous. So I wanted to start this morning by posing what seems like a simple question. What is a documentary filmmaker? It's one of those questions, should be a piece of cake, right? But when I thought about it for a while and I meditated on it, and I'm still thinking about it, all I could feel were the contradictions in that. So here goes, a documentary filmmaker. A documentary filmmaker is someone who captures real life on film, right? And shapes that into an experience the audience can appreciate. Captures the real life. Let's start with that. Like if a camera crew were to follow me around for a couple of weeks, boring, but okay, follow you around for a couple of weeks, they'd capture real life, right? Is that what they would capture? Can we really say that there's no script and there are no performances in our real lives? I'm sure I'm not the only one here who finds that slippery. I'm reading something right now that I wrote, and in a couple of minutes we'll be finished and we'll exchange remarks. Is that real life? You know, you might pitch me something. Is that a scripted experience? And as you tell these stories, as you look into documentary film, you realize that the majority of documentary films are in fact scripted. And they sometimes do what we do in our real lives, which is they flatter themselves, the subjects flatter themselves, or the documentary filmmakers flatter themselves. But the majority of all films, include from PBS's Frontline to last year's winner of the Best Documentary Feature, Icarus, are scripted. Icarus had 4 credited screenwriters, and that's more than most feature films, and feature films which require an actor to deliver a performance. And we could also talk about the role of the editor in scripting documentary films, but I think that's the subject of another keynote altogether. So when we talk about performances, documentary filmmakers don't explicitly employ actors, right? They don't really create performances, or do they? You know, and so I think you could look to the work of Joshua Oppenheimer, who directed Act of Killing, in which he recruited an elderly Indonesian man to recreate scenes from a mass murder he participated in as a death squad leader. And maybe in that case, and maybe in other cases, by establishing a very artificial premise, the filmmaker found a way to get to an even more honest truth, a totally different accounting of the past events. And in this case, a reckoning with the country's past horrors. Oppenheimer called his documentary a documentary of the imagination. And he said that by giving people the chance to perform, it's like putting reality through a prism. But if we set aside the idea of acting as staging and delivering lines to the camera, the fact remains that performance is in human nature. It's just simply in our nature to perform, to alter ourselves in front of the lens of the camera. So let me clarify a few thoughts as I've been thinking about this. Once at a film festival, I had the great pleasure of serving on a jury with the wonderful filmmaker Barbara Koppel. She's a goddess in our industry, 2-time Academy Award winner. And her films are honest and raw and very, very compelling. And I was struggling with what I didn't like about a certain film. And she said, oh, I know, it's, you know, I don't believe the film. I feel that the filmmaker, sorry, the light here is bad. I feel that the filmmaker sent that person on that journey solely to make that film. So the whole film was built on a false premise, a fabrication. She spotted it, I did, and let me tell you, the audience does too. So it's like when you're trying to be convinced of something by a person you know is creating a version of events just for you, or even worse, lying. And this, of course, is an area as wide, a gray area as wide as the ocean. So if you take a minute to look at YouTube, you can find works that call themselves documentaries, right? Works that will claim that the Holocaust was a hoax, the Holocaust never happened, or that Sandy Hook was a hoax. And they're absurdities, but they're trumpeted in these days as the truth. And I would certainly never want to put legitimate documentary filmmakers on the same level as ghouls like Alex Jones. But then again, we're coming up to the 100th anniversary of Robert Flaherty's wonderful film, Nanook of the North, about an Inuit tribe in the Arctic. And we're reminded that documentary has always grappled with the legacy of that film, and with the fact that Flaherty staged multiple sequences to render his view of his subjects' lives. And that brings me to reenactments. Reenactments could easily be the subject of their own keynote. And the fantastic filmmaker Errol Morris, who's another deity among us, is the chief architect of these staged reenactments, especially in his dazzling film, A Thin Blue Line. Those stylish reenactments created a different version of the truth, a different perception in that case, and they led to the release of a wrongly imprisoned man. It also reminds me of the name Marie Colvin. Marie was a journalist who was as tough as nails and tireless, and she gave her very life in 2012 to cover the story of what was happening in Homs, Syria. Matt Heineman, who's a brilliant documentary filmmaker whom I worked with on Cartel Land and City of Ghosts, has just completed a feature film on Marie's life, starring actress Rosamund Pike. But here's why I mentioned her. I just also worked on a film called Under the Wire, which is the same story about Marie's life and death and what happened in Homs, Syria in 2012, told from the point of view of her photographer who was with her and survived, Paul Conroy. It's a very important work, and while we were making it, we were confronted with a kind of documentary ethics question. What happened was the BBC, who was one of our partners, were uncomfortable with some of the recreations on the film because they're not openly disclosed to the audience in some way as recreations. If it looks too much like real footage, the argument goes, you fall into perilous territory. I was fine with it in this case because I felt the first-person narrative was so crystal clear that it worked. My husband, who I debated with it about, was not fine with it. Every situation is different, and that's also fine. And we're going to disagree about many things, including the definition of what is a documentary filmmaker. And there's not a single answer, of course, and I can't even agree with myself on it. So I'm going to propose an exercise to help figure this out. I'm going to take 5 other professions and look at how they entwine with the DNA of a documentary filmmaker. And in doing so, I hope to elaborate on how critically important filmmakers are in our lives. I just mentioned Marie Colvin, so let's start with documentary filmmaker as journalist. Journalists, contrary to some things you might have heard recently, are in pursuit of one thing and one thing alone, the truth. So if somebody says it's raining and somebody says it's not, the journalist doesn't print that it's raining, and it might be raining and it might not. The journalist goes outside to figure out whether it's raining and reports that. But I don't have to remind you how much journalists are under attack, how an ugly totalitarian term like enemy of the people has been dredged up by people who should know better. But example after example, we find the way that journalists are the beacons of ethical standards in their journalism. The Washington Post, for example, which won a Pulitzer Prize this year in its coverage of the special Senate election in Alabama. In covering that race, the Washington Post got a tip from a woman who said that the Republican candidate who was under fire for sexual assault allegations had impregnated her when she was 15. There's incredible undercover footage that you should take a look at of the reporter interviewing this woman. And there was a problem with her story. She was lying. The Post discovered she worked for a right-wing sting group. And she was trying to prove that Roy Moore, she was trying to plant a fake story in the Washington Post. She was trying to prove that the Washington Post published fake news, and she ended up proving the opposite, that the Washington Post does not publish fake news. Then there's Maggie Haberman from the New York Times, who's been criticized for not harshly interviewing her subject. She's been covering Trump world for the last 3 years. She's been criticized for not grilling her subject harshly enough, and she doesn't do that. She lets him speak, and then there's no filter anyway, but she doesn't go in for the kill. And again, to bring up Cartel Land, Matt Heineman's documentary about the US drug war, there's one review of the film that was in a major newspaper, which actually criticized the immersive observational nature of the film and said there should have been more talking heads interviews, more experts, more tougher questions, more context. Why? Why do we need that? Don't we trust the viewer to be able to understand and perceive the things that Matt was trying to convey in that film? Matt has an incredible gift for telling emotional stories about men, especially living on the edge. They're very intimate. And he filmed inside a torture chamber. He filmed in a meth lab. He filmed at a mass grave. He was documenting things the way a journalist did. But he put it together in a much more immersive, challenging piece of work. And that's daring, in the way that great journalism is often daring. It leaves us to draw our own conclusions about what he's seen. And to me, that's a thing worth a lot. Then sometimes a filmmaker will give a subject room to lie. In making The Imposter, Bart Layton, who was the director, was exploring the kind of subjective nature of the truth. He made a Rashomon-like film with 3 different stories: the story of the family, the story of the family of the boy who went missing, the story of his imposter, and the story of the detective and the FBI agent who were trying to investigate what happened. But in early focus groups, we had people who wanted to be told exactly what happened. They wanted talking heads interviews to tell us, is he a psychopath? Is the imposter a psychopath? Rather than sit with the uncomfortable realities and complexities of the situation. The second job comparison that I found is documentary filmmaker as historian. And I'd bring up the wonderful work of Claude Lanzmann, who directed the 9-hour epic Holocaust documentary Shoah. Lanzmann spent years excavating personal stories, which are essentially on film become as real as physical artifacts. He wandered for days through the South Bronx to find a certain barber who he finally found. And the interview he conducted with that barber is one of the most gripping and essential interviews of all time. I've recently worked with Charles Ferguson, who's made definitive documentaries on the Iraq War and the 2008 financial crisis, and now has directed an amazing epic 4-hour film on Watergate, which, by the way, is entitled How We Learned to Stop an Out-of-Control President. Also, Frederick Wiseman, who, if I'm not mistaken, I saw walk into the building before. Frederick Wiseman is 88 years old, and he makes a documentary a year. He should really be up here talking to you, not me. But his films examine the inner workings of institutions, boxing gyms, hospitals, libraries, and his style is highly observational and non-manipulative, right? But of course, Wiseman is making thousands of choices and decisions as he makes his film. The same could be said of the Maysles brothers, Albert and David, who made Salesmen and Grey Gardens, among other heartbreaking works of people on society's edge. But Al Maysles once said to me he couldn't stand it when people would contrast documentary film with narrative film. Like, he said, of course documentary films are narrative films, obviously, and it's essential. Thirdly, the documentary filmmaker can sometimes act as a therapist or counselor. So we have filmmakers who have found stories that help us to see how we face challenges, or they've found universal lessons in the way others face challenges in their lives. And I had the gift of working with Roger Ross Williams on Life Animated about the Susskind family. Journalist Ron Susskind and his wife Cornelia and their son Owen, who is autistic. And Owen has found a way to retrieve language through the Disney films that he loves. The film was a powerful experience for the Susskind family to make, and it's also full of universal lessons. Murder Ball is another wonderfully open-hearted documentary about quadriplegic athletes who play wheelchair rugby. And the two directors, Henry Alex Rubin and David Adam Shapiro, they weren't for a second asking us to pity these athletes, quite the contrary. And if we, take a look at them, we can almost feel embarrassed by their strength and their fight. This type of documentary filmmaker is also capable of getting subjects to turn inward, look inward. Matt Tyrnauer made a wonderful film called Studio 54, in which he got the co-founder of Studio 54, that wild nightclub, the sort of most famous nightclub in the world, to look inward and to the film almost acted like a therapist's couch for Schrager, to confront some of the personal demons that he had to deal with, and part of which led to the downfall of the club. Also in New York, but at the other end of the spectrum, you have James Solomon's Witness. I think it's The Witness, and Yancey Ford's Strong Island, which is a haunting film. They both tell stories of loved ones who were violently killed. And they do so through the grief and pain of the family, and ultimately the catharsis of family members. Fourthly, we have the documentary filmmaker as political activist. This is not a place where you'd bring up the New York Times or Frontline, but it's a great place to talk about somebody who I really have a lot of regard for, Michael Moore. I'm a huge fan of Michael Moore, because what he does unapologetically is to express a point of view. His opinions, his humor, his confusion, his frustration, they're all essential to his films, but they're not mere opinion pieces. They're sort of passionate pleas on behalf of the regular guy who's been forgotten and just wants a fair shake. I also want to mention one of my favorite documentaries of all time, Hotel Terminus, Marcel Ophuls' amazing look at the monstrous life of a Gestapo leader. It won the Oscar in 1988. It's another 4.5-hour epic with the scope of it and characters of a Dickens novel. But there's a palpable anger in that film. Ophuls is mad. He's furious about what was the atrocities that were committed and the indifference of some people in the face of those atrocities. Hotel Terminus is not objective at all. Why should it be? His interviews are masterful. The film's biased, it's urgent, it's enraged, and it's essential. Lastly, I'd talk about the documentary filmmaker as poet. I've also recently had the great pleasure of working with Werner Herzog, who premiered his wonderful film on Mikhail Gorbachev recently at film festivals. Werner gets uncomfortable when people bring up some area of the story that they find factually incomplete. He says, but I'm not a historian, I'm a poet. I love that. Where does the truth fit into that concept? He's not going to include fake details in his work, but his films are about a feeling. They're lyrical, ethereal, strange, and unique. When he made his 3D film about cave paintings, he found a way to access the soul of the cavemen through talking to scientists about their past and their dreams. In Encounters at the End of the World, he first asks a scientist if it's possible for penguins to go insane. Herzog says filmmakers should never be flies on the wall. They should be the hornets that go out and sting. So many filmmakers have used a poetic form to ask deeper questions. Actress Sarah Polley's film, Stories We Tell, is like a dream that kind of floats backward through her family history. Or Laurie Anderson, the musician whose beautiful film, Heart of a Dog, is like an experimental ballad to her beloved pet. So here's what I know about documentary filmmakers. They have the determination of a journalist, the insights of a historian, the generosity of a counselor, the fury of a political activist, and the warmth and wisdom of a poet. A journalist, a historian, a counselor, an activist, and a poet. It almost sounds like the beginning of a bad joke. But I can also possibly help elucidate this by telling you what I know if a documentary filmmaker is not. A documentary filmmaker is not a stenographer. Mere cans of film don't make a documentary. A documentary filmmaker is not a publicist. Some of the worst films I've ever seen have been heavily influenced by the subject. Beware of soft documentaries made by the subject's best friend. That's a birthday card, not a documentary. And lastly, a documentary filmmaker is not the audience. Too often we've seen filmmakers appeasing the audience by offering no perspective, or worse, every perspective. Take the example of Grizzly Man, Werner Herzog's portrait of Timothy Treadwell, who's this self-made naturalist who goes to Alaska to live among the grizzly bears and is ultimately killed by one. There's a moment late in the film when Treadwell is ranting against the park workers that he's worked with for many years, and also society in general. And Herzog kind of dips the audio, and he says, here's where Treadwell crosses a line we will not cross. And I love the way he phrases that, because what he's saying is it goes right to the heart of the matter. He's saying this is where we differ. It's essential. He's the filmmaker. We're the audience. And we should never settle for anything less. How many times have audiences, and certainly film critics as well, praised the subject or subject matter as opposed to the actual filmmaking when discussing a documentary? Don't fall into that trap. Be tougher than that, because we're at a moment in time when there are more opportunities than ever to make and distribute your documentary. And when the very nature of truth is under attack at the highest levels, the documentary filmmaker takes on new importance. I need them in my life as much as I need journalism, history, counsel, activism, and poetry. And so do you. For us and for them, I'll end with one word that's taken on a whole new meaning in this whole new age: resist. Thank you.